revenge. It is the theme for stories, going back to the earliest of times. It can be shockingly literal and visceral. It could topple kings, raise cities, change the fate of empires. From the steppes of Central Asia to the far isles of Britannia, the courts of Chinese kings to the villages of ancient Vietnam and India, acts of vengeance left their mark on history. Of course, revenge was a powerful motivator in the ancient world, not just a theme for myths, tragedies, but a real force, one that drove political and military events. And so today, we are going to look at several real historical tales of ancient revenge, stories that are drawn from historical records, either at their time or very close to. And we'll see how these personal vendettas and quests for justice shape the course of nations. Now, these accounts preserved by ancient historians and chroniclers are both educational and engaging. We're not going to be taking too much dramatic license, but we will be telling them as much in an entertaining way as we can. After all, the history is still real. And each tale, of course, stands on its own, yet they paint a picture of a image of revenge as a universal human experience transcending cultures. After all, everyone loves a good revenge story, don't they? Well, before we begin and get on to our first story, let me just welcome you to the channel. If you're not subscribed yet, I invite you to hit the subscribe button. And if you want to help me out, well, you can leave a comment and like the video. It always just helps bump up the algorithm a little bit. Makes a big difference for us here, getting the video out. And also, you will get no ads in this video at all. That is because we are supported by Patreon members, YouTube members, super thanks and PayPal donations, and also those who chose to check out the merch store, where we got plenty of t-shirts, mugs, things like that. So if you want to find those relevant links, you'll find them in the pinned comment, video description, and channel description. Now, with that being said, let's get nice and relaxed today and look at our stories of revenge. First, let's look at a story that comes from the 6th century BCE. That is of Queen Tomyris and Cyrus the Great. Herodotus, that's where we get our information from. He's from the 5th century, so a little bit later on, and he recounts one of the most dramatic revenge tales of the ancient Near East. It is the confrontation between Queen Tomyris of Massagathe and Cyrus the Great of Persia. Cyrus was the founding emperor of the Achaemenid Persian Empire, a brilliant conqueror by anyone's measure, who had already subdued kingdoms like Media, Lydia, and, I'm sure you've heard of this one, Babylon. And it was a big deal to subdue Babylon. In fact, a lot of the kings of ancient Persia and Mesopotamia, all the rest, regardless of where they were born at, regardless of where they ruled from, they all coveted that title, King of Babylon. Very much a big deal, anyway. So in the 530s BCE, he set up his sights on Massagathe, that is a nomadic confederation in Central Asia near the Caspian Sea. Of course, this was ruled over by Queen Tomyris. Initially, Cyrus attempted guile. According to Herodotus, he proposed marriage to Tomyris, perhaps thinking to acquire her land without a fight. Tomyris, a proud ruler, saw through the ploy and rejected the offer, and she warned Cyrus not to advance any further into her territory. She even sent a message urging him to be satisfied with his empire and not meddle with the Massagathe, foretelling that persistence would end in his ruin. But Cyrus was on a bit of a roll, you see. Like I said, he'd already conquered Babylon and all these other little kingdoms, and he was confident in Persia's military might. So, of course, the old hubris, he ignored the warning. What followed was a war sparked as much by Cyrus's imperial ambition as by Tomyris's determination to avenge an unforgivable personal loss. You see, in the initial clash, Cyrus used a stratagem. He left behind a banquet of wine and delicacies at an abandoned camp. The Massagetæ forces, who were unaccustomed to strong wine, indulged, and they became easy prey. Among the captives taken by Cyrus's army was Spargapises, Tomyris's own son, and a commander of the troops nonetheless. When Spargapises awoke from his drunken stupor and realized that he was a prisoner, he was so distraught and ashamed of himself that he took his own life. As for Queen Tomyris, she heard of this and her grief was profound. Think about it. She'd lost her only son. And not in a good way either. Nothing honorable to look at, no honorable death in battle. No, he was just captured under deceptive circumstances and driven to take his own life. Grief turned to fury, and Tomyris swore the fiercest vengeance. Her message to Cyrus, as Herodotus records it, was quite chilling on its own. She accused him of cowardice for using his wine to defeat her son rather than an honest battle, and vowed, quote from Herodotus, "I live and have conquered you in fight, but by guile you ruined my son. Hear this oath, as you thirsted for blood, so I will give you your fill of blood." Such words, attributed to the barbarian queen, certainly show how personal this conflict had become. So, Tomyris marshaled her forces for a decisive battle. The enraged queen and her Massagetæ warriors met Cyrus's Persian army in a fearsome engagement that, according to Herodotus, was one of the bloodiest battles of that age. Despite Cyrus's experience and the Persian reputation for discipline, the Massagetæ, fighting on their home terrain, galvanized by their queen's thirst for vengeance, managed to overwhelm the superior Persian force. Cyrus the Great, the till now undefeated conqueror, was himself killed in the confrontation. The Persian army suffered a crushing and embarrassing defeat. But that wasn't all. What Tomyris did next cemented her place in history. Determined to literally fulfill her oath, she searched the battlefield for Cyrus's corpse. When it was found, she beheaded Cyrus's body. Tomyris then took a wine skin, or a large bowl in some versions, filled it with blood, possibly the blood of Persian soldiers, and plunged Cyrus's severed head into it. She then proclaimed, according to the ancient accounts, "I warned you I would quench your thirst for blood, and so I have done it." Well, a ghastly and symbolic act of revenge, of course. The man who had caused her son's death, accused of being bloodthirsty, was posthumously sated with blood. Ancient chroniclers like Herodotus clearly relished the story. The image of a barbarian queen humbling a great king of the age is quite striking. And we have to, from a modern historian point of view, treat some details with a little bit of caution. Herodotus wrote nearly a century after Cyrus's death and acknowledged multiple versions of the tale. And there are Persian sources that either don't mention Tomyris or give different accounts of Cyrus's demise. Some later writers suggest Cyrus died in another battle, or even peacefully. Yet, we still have that version from Herodotus, and I think it's worth telling. It certainly endured, perhaps because it spoke to deeper truths valued by the ancients, that danger of hubris, and the idea that divine justice could work through the hands of a wronged woman. Tomyris, in Herodotus's narrative, embodies righteous vengeance. She refused to be intimidated by a superpower and used Cyrus's own overconfidence against him. The brutality of her revenge was shocking. But in the moral universe of Herodotus's histories, it served as a kind of counterbalance. Cyrus's overreach and deception had ultimately earned him a gruesome end. But it also gives us a little bit of intriguing context about steppe culture and women in power at the time. Tomyris is described as a queen who personally led her warriors, unusual from a Greek perspective, but among the Central Asian nomads, not entirely unheard of. In ancient steppe societies, women could hold high authority, and avenging kin, well, that was a sacred duty for everyone. The story of Tomyris and Cyrus illustrates that revenge in ancient times was not just for dispossessed princes or betrayed generals. Even a widowed queen on the steppe, commanding what the Persians might have seen as barbarians, could alter the destiny of empire through sheer resolve and ferocity. Of course, whichever case it was, the Massagetæ victory over Persia had lasting implication. Cyrus's death in 530 halted Persian expansion in that direction, at least temporarily, and of course it became a legend, whispered by those who opposed Persian might. Well, let's move on to the next one, where we find ourselves in Roman Britain. In the 1st century of the Common Era, under the Roman Empire's occupation of Britannia, a rebellion erupted that nearly expelled the Romans from the island. Well, at its heart was Boudicca, queen of the Iceni tribe, who led a fierce revolt driven by revenge for appalling personal injustices. Our principal sources, the Roman historians Tacitus and Cassius Dio, provide detailed, if a little bit Roman-biased accounts of what happened. Boudicca was the wife of King Prasutagus of the Iceni, a tribe in what is now East Anglia. Prasutagus had been an ally of Rome, and upon his death around 60 CE, he left a will dividing his kingdom between his own family, Boudicca and their 2 daughters, and the Roman emperor too, hoping to secure favor and protection. But instead of honoring this arrangement, Roman officials treated the Iceni lands just as they would any other conquered territory. According to the Annals of Tacitus, the local Roman authorities, led by Procurator Decianus Catus, and Roman soldiers, seized the Iceni's property, flogged Queen Boudicca publicly, and most horrifically, 2 of her young daughters were physically assaulted. This assault on the queen's dignity and her children's safety was a blatant abuse of power, but it was also a direct affront to Iceni noble culture and human decency, a provocation that almost designed to incite rebellion itself. Tacitus notes that the chief men of the Iceni were also dispossessed of their lands and treated like slaves. So what had been a cooperative client kingdom was turned by Roman greed and brutality into a powder keg of resentment. And just a reminder, this is the way that the Romans are telling it. So they didn't leave out the details of the gruesome parts of what happened. Well, for Boudicca, the personal humiliation was compounded by her duty as a mother and leader. The Romans had violated the fundamental laws of hospitality and alliance. Now vengeance became a matter of honor. In 60 or 61 CE, while the Roman governor Suetonius Paulinus was away campaigning in Wales, against the Druids on Mona, by the way, Boudicca rallied her people and neighboring tribes to revolt. The neighboring Trinovantes joined enthusiastically. You see, they too had suffered under Roman rule, especially when the veterans settled at the Roman colony of Camalodunum, is modern-day Colchester, who had been oppressing locals and confiscating their lands. And the timing for all this was perfect. Roman forces were thin at the province, and the Britons had unity under this charismatic leadership of Boudicca. As for the ancient accounts, they emphasize Boudicca's extraordinary presence. Cassius Dio describes her as tall and fearsome-looking, with long, tawny hair falling to her hips, wearing a large golden torque around her neck and a colorful tunic, a striking figure in a war chariot. These details, albeit from a later source, show how the Romans perceived her, an embodiment of barbarian pride and fury. Tacitus, in his Annals, provides a compelling speech attributed to Boudicca before the final battle, which reveals her motives. Riding in a chariot with her daughters beside her, Boudicca allegedly told her warriors that she was not fighting, quote, as a queen of noble lineage for my lost kingdom, but as an ordinary woman for my liberty and for vengeance. She reminded them of the indignities that she had suffered, her body bruised by Roman whips, her daughter's honor defiled, and cast the war as a struggle of an oppressed people against a bloodthirsty invader. Tacitus has her say in the account, "This is a woman's resolve. As for you men, you can live and be slaves if you want." Such words, whether or not Boudicca actually spoke them this way, were intended to ignite the Britons' sense of injustice and outrage. By Tacitus' account, Boudicca presented herself as driven by revenge for her own and her people's wrongs, and she invoked divine support for what she framed as a just rebellion. Of course, the rebellion was initially stunningly successful, which speaks to how widespread resentment against the Romans had grown. Boudicca's forces first targeted Camalodunum, that hated Roman colony. They razed the city to the ground, slaughtering not only the hated Roman veterans, but also their families and any Roman or collaborators they found. Archaeology confirms a layer of destruction and charred debris at Colchester dating to this revolt, a testament to the thorough vengeance inflicted. A Roman legion, that being the 9th Legion, sent to relieve the city, was ambushed on the way and nearly annihilated by Boudicca's warriors. Just another blow to Roman prestige. Things were not looking good. And it was at this time where Boudicca doubled down. She marched on Londinium, modern-day London, which was then a burgeoning trade town, but undefended. The Roman governor Suetonius was rushing back from Wales and could not assemble enough forces to protect Londinium, and made a painful decision to evacuate those who could flee, leaving the rest to their fate. The Britons entered London, and they put it to the torch, massacring the inhabitants in a frenzy of revenge. The pattern repeated at Verulamium, that is modern-day St. Albans, another Romanized town. It too was burned and its population slaughtered. Ancient sources claim that in these onslaughts some 70 to 80,000 Romans and pro-Roman Britons were killed, often by gruesome methods. Cassius Dio sensationally writes that Britons hanged, burned, and crucified their captives, even impaling noble Roman women and cutting off their breasts in ritualistic displays of vengeance. These may be exaggerated atrocity stories, but they certainly convey the horror with which the Romans viewed the uprising. A, quote, just revenge from the Britons' perspective became, in the Roman eyes, a nightmarish bloodbath. Well, it is important to, of course, critically assess these accounts. After all, this is a history channel, so we do have to look at them with a bit of a discerning eye. Now, Tacitus likely inflated the drama, only to highlight Roman heroism in quelling the revolt, illustrating that brutality can erupt from oppressed peoples, and perhaps that was a warning of sorts too. However, the core truth is undeniable. Boudicca's revolt was fueled by a genuine sense of injustice. The Britons targeted symbols of Roman power and collaborators, which indicates that this was not just mindless savagery, but directed rebellion. Boudicca's personal grievance galvanized a broader anti-Roman movement. The scale of the destruction shows how quickly anger at abuse can turn into large-scale violence against the perceived oppressors. The Roman response, once they regrouped, was obviously merciless, and ultimately decisive. Governor Suetonius Paulus managed to concentrate perhaps around 10,000 soldiers, a mix of the 14th Legion, parts of the 20th, and auxiliaries. Though vastly outnumbered by Boudicca's host, some ancient sources put her forces at 100,000, which, once again, might be an exaggeration. The Romans had discipline and tactics on their side. They chose a battleground narrow enough to negate the Britons' numeric advantage. Before the battle, Tacitus depicts Boudicca driving along the ranks in her chariot, invoking the injustice done to her and urging her people to courage, a scene meant to contrast with Suetonius's terse, soldierly exhortation at his legionaries. In the ensuing battle, locations uncertain by the way, perhaps along Watling Street, Roman tactics prevailed. The legion stood firm in a defile and hurled their javelins, then advanced in tight formation. The Britons, with their families, watching from wagons in the rear, a sign of confidence that backfired, were eventually trapped against these wagons when they began to flee. The Romans slaughtered combatants and non-combatants alive. Tacitus claims that around 80,000 Britons fell in the final battle, compared to just a few hundred Romans. Once again, likely an exaggeration, but it conveys a complete Roman victory. Boudicca herself did not fall in battle. According to Tacitus, she took poison afterward to avoid capture. Cassius Dio suggests that she fell ill and died, but in either case, she escaped the fate of being paraded in a Roman triumph, which would have been the ultimate humiliation, of course. And so with Boudicca's death, the rebellion collapsed. The Romans enacted harsh vengeance of their own. Troops under Suetonius ravaged any remaining pockets of resistance. Tacitus remarks that, that famine followed, partly because so many Britons had concentrated on war that they neglected their harvests, a tragic aftermath illustrating how the quest for revenge, even if initially successful, can bring devastating consequence to both sides. Now back in Rome, the Emperor Nero, alarmed by losses, considered withdrawing from Britain entirely. But eventually the province was reinforced and remained under Roman rule for centuries. Suetonius Paulinus was replaced for being too punitive. The imperial government, now the crisis was over, sought a more conciliatory approach to avoid future revolts. Well, I suppose everybody learned a kind of lesson. Some lessons are learned the hard way. Well, let's shift our focus away from the Roman world now. We go to the Far East. Ancient Chinese history offers its own tales of revenge. And one of the most famous stories of that is that of Wu Zixu in the late spring and autumn period, that is the 5th century BCE. Now, Wu Zixu's tale, recorded by the great Han Dynasty historian Sima Qian in the records of the Grand Historian, is a classic tale of personal revenge intertwining with interstate warfare. It involves deceit at the royal court, a loyal minister's family tragedy, and a patient and calculated plot that ultimately changed the power dynamic among states in ancient China. So, Wu Zixu, also known as Wu Yun, was a nobleman of the state of Chu. His father, Wu She, was a respected Chu minister. According to the historical accounts, Wu She fell victim to court intrigue. You see, the king of Chu at the time, King Ping of Chu, was swayed by a malicious advisor who accused Wu She and his eldest son of treason or disloyalty. King Ping, a ruler known for his cruelty, had Wu She and Wu Zixu's older brother executed unjustly. Young Wu Zixu barely managed to escape capture himself. He instantly became a wanted fugitive in Chu, marked for death by the king who had killed his family. So we can only imagine the emotional toll. Wu Zixu had not only lost his beloved father and brother, but he lost them in a dishonorable way. They were condemned as traitors. In the Confucian-influenced culture of China, filial piety and loyalty to one's family were the most important things. Avenging a wrongly killed father was not allowed. Not merely allowed, rather. It was often seen as a solemn duty, one that later Confucian scholars would call great revenge. Well, Wu Zixu's life, from that moment, became dedicated to one goal: to avenge the deaths of his father and brother by punishing King Ping of Chu and his regime. The journey to vengeance, though, was arduous. Wu Zixu had to flee for his life as Chu forces hunted him. There are legendary episodes of his escape. One famous anecdote tells of how he disguised himself and even managed to pass through an extremely well-guarded checkpoint by hiding in a corpse or making clever use of a friend's sacrifice. Sources vary on the exact method. Another part of his legend is that by the time he reached the border of Chu, the stress had caused his hair to turn completely white overnight, which of course added to his disguise. Well, it's possibly apocryphal tales, but they certainly highlight how desperate he wanted to survive and fulfill his mission. Wu Zixu fled to the neighboring state of Wu, which, despite the similar name, was a different kingdom, by the way, located in the Yangtze Delta region. The state of Wu was then a rising power, often in conflict with Chu. Wu Zixu's misfortune became his new fortune. You see, in Wu Kingdom, he found a cause and patrons that aligned with his desire for vengeance. He entered the servants of Prince Guang of Wu. Here, another layer of intrigue unfolds. You see, Prince Guang himself sought to usurp the throne of Wu from his cousin King Liao. Wu Zixu assisted Prince Guang in a successful palace assassination with the help of a skilled chef-turned-assassin in 516, after which Prince Guang became King He Lu of Wu. Now for Wu Zixu, helping He Lu was not just opportunism, but it was part of a larger strategy. He knew that as an exile he needed the military might of a state like Wu to strike at Chu. King He Lu, once in power, valued Wu Zixu's counsel greatly and made him one of his chief ministers. Under He Lu, and with Wu Zixu as a strategist, the state of Wu built up its strength. Notably, it was during this time that Sun Tzu, the reputed author of the art of war, is said to have been a general in Wu's army, by the way. Pretty remarkable constellation of figures, all allied against the Chu. Well, in 506 BCE, the moment for revenge finally came. King He Lu of Wu, advised by Wu Zixu, launched a major invasion of Chu. The motivations were geopolitical as well as personal. You see, Chu was large, a traditionally dominant state, but it had recently shown internal weaknesses that Wu could easily exploit. For Wu Zixu, of course, it was the chance of a lifetime to destroy the king who had killed his family. The Wu army, guided by Sun Tzu's tactics and Wu Zixu's intimate knowledge of the Chu landscape, won a decisive victory at the Battle of Boudicca. Despite Chu's larger size and resources, the Chu forces were outmaneuvered. Wu Zixu had reportedly advised a daring strategy of striking deep into Chu territory, catching the enemy off guard. And the plan worked. Chu's armies faltered, and King Zhao of Chu, that is the son of the late King Ping, King Ping himself had died by this time, fled his capital city, Ying, as the invaders approached. And for the first time in history, an enemy captured Ying, the venerable capital of the Chu. For Wu Zixu, this was the climax of years of sacrifice and struggle. He entered the capital of Chu as a victorious avenger, and one of his first acts was to search for the remains of King Ping, the very one responsible for his father's death. Of course, King Ping was long dead and buried in the royal tombs of Chu, but this did not stop Wu Zixu's drive for retributive justice. As Sima Qian recounts, Wu Zixu had King Ping's tomb opened. He located the king's corpse, or ashes depending on the version, and then desecrated it as a punishment. In the most vivid version of the story, Wu Zixu took a whip and lashed the corpse of King Ping 300 times. So you can imagine the symbolism, each lash a repayment for the pain that his family had suffered. And by flogging the dead king, Wu Zixu was delivering a message that even in death, the tyrant would not escape accountability. It was an act both deeply personal, but also symbolic in a political sense. It showed to all of Chu's people that King Ping's lineage was cursed, and that the injustice he committed had been avenged by the very man he sought to destroy. Now that is one revenge story. That's for sure. Of course, contemporary Chinese accounts saw Wu Zixu's revenge as a double-edged matter. You see, on one hand, Confucian historians who valued filial piety could certainly understand Wu Zixu's loyalty to his father's memory. He fulfilled the ancient dictum of repaying blood with blood. But, on the other hand, excessive vengeance, and especially the disturbance of the dead, could be seen as extreme. Yet Wu Zixu's actions were generally portrayed sympathetically in the context of Chu's decadence and cruelty. He became somewhat of a legendary figure, one that exemplified loyalty and persistence. Chinese writings even coined the term Wu Zixu's enmity as a byword for grievance that must be avenged regardless of the passage of time. And of course, just quickly, there is a saying that I like in Chinese. Now, I've mentioned it before, but I just love it. 君子报仇10年不晚. For a gentleman to take revenge, 10 years is not too far to wait. I love that. I suppose we can look at Wu Zixu's waiting. You can't just get kicked out of the city and start banging on the city walls with your fists. Let me back in, let me at 'em. You have to plan things out. You have to wait, you have to gather your strength. And then, well, as with Wu Zixu's enmity, you can avenge it even after that passage of time. But the story does not end with revenge, however. Wu Zixu continued to serve the state of Wu as a high-ranking minister. Ironically, and perhaps tragically, his life itself ended in a cautionary tale about court politics and the nature of favor. You see, after King He Lu died, his son, King Fu Chai of Wu, ascended to the throne. Fu Chai was initially successful with Wu Zixu's help. Wu even defeated the powerful state of Qi. However, Fu Chai's attention was eventually turned to a rivalry with the state of Yue to the south. As Wu Zixu cautioned the new king about future threats, he was worried that Gou Jian of Yue, a neighboring king, might rise against Wu, which indeed did happen later. Fu Chai began to distrust his old advisor. A treacherous minister, eager to remove Wu Zixu's influence, slandered him, suggesting Wu Zixu might betray Wu, or was perhaps too pessimistic. But despite Wu Zixu's past service, King Fu Chai grew suspicious, and he ultimately ordered Wu Zixu to take his own life, a command of royal favor, withdrawal that amounted to an execution. Before dying, Wu Zixu famously told bystanders to take his eyes after death and hang them on the city gate, so that his eyes could watch Fujai's kingdom be conquered. A final prophecy that Wu would actually fall to Yue, which indeed it did, a few years later when King Goujian of Yue invaded and defeated Wu. Wu Zixu's foresight was vindicated, though he did not live to see it. But this coda to Wu Zixu's revenge story adds a layer of depth and irony. He achieved his great revenge, the downfall of his enemy's house. But in doing so, he became so entwined in power politics that he eventually fell victim to another cycle of intrigue. Ancient commentators saw in Wu Zixu's end a lesson about the perils of serving capricious rulers and the tragic fate of even the greatest heroes at court. Yet it did not tarnish the luster of this revenge tale. To this very day, hang on. Oh yes, there I am. To this very day, Wu Zixu is remembered, especially in Suzhou, that is the capital of ancient Wu, as a cultural hero. Temples were dedicated to him, and folklore celebrates his perseverance. And there is another idiom, by the way, that could very well be applied to his actions. That is, fu zhou xue hen, to avenge and wash away hatred. Now, that's certainly one that's lasted the test of time. Well, our next story, we need to go south. We find ourselves in ancient Vietnam under the shadow of the Han dynasty's expansion. It features two sisters who led one of the ancient world's few large-scale rebellions by female leaders. They are known to history as the Trung Sisters, Trung Trac and Trung Nghe. I think I'm pronouncing the Vietnamese right. I hope so. Well, and their personal revolt against the Chinese rule in 40 to 43 CE is a powerful example of revenge for both personal and national grief. The primary records of their insurrection appear in Chinese histories, particularly in the Hou Han Shu, the Book of Later Han, which was compiled in the 5th century CE. Though written from the perspective of the victorious Han empires, it preserves the outline of the sisters' exploits. Vietnamese oral tradition and later chronicles add some details. Well, some of them are legendary. In any case, it has made the Trung sisters iconic figures in Vietnam. So the story begins in the 1st century CE, northern Vietnam, then often referred to as Jiao Zhi or Giao Zhi in Han records. Well, it was under Han Chinese colonial administration at the time. The local population, often called the Lac Viet, had their own nobles and customs, but they were overseen by the Chinese governors and subject to imperial taxation and law. Trung Trac was the daughter of a Lac lord in Mei Lin in the Red River Delta, and she married Tri Sac, who was a lord of a neighboring district of Chu Dien. These were aristocratic families of Vietnamese society, and they resented certain Chinese policies, especially the heavy taxation and the undermining of indigenous Vietnamese lands, rights, and customs. The historical trigger for the rebellion, however, was deeply personal. The Chinese governor of Giao Zhi, named Su Ding, or Do Din in Vietnamese tradition, executed Trung Trac's husband, T Sac, around 40 CE. Chinese sources imply T Sac was executed because he had been plotting or voicing opposition to Han authority. He was, quote, of a fierce temperament, the texts say, and likely tried to rally others against injustices. In any case, his summary execution without trial was a brutal act meant to cow the local nobility. But it didn't do that. Instead, it ignited them. Trung Trac, now widowed and outraged, became the rallying point for resistance. She and her younger sister, Trung Nye, raised a banner of revolt. Now explicitly, as the Hohan Shu notes, to avenge the killing of her husband. It was revenge, but not only for Tisak. The sisters tapped into a broad well of discontent. Many local chiefs and their people were just fed up with the oppressive rule of Su Ding, who was remembered as cruel and rapacious, a tyrant in the true sense. The Trung sisters, coming from a respected family and now with a martyr to inspire them, provided leadership that had been lacking. It's significant that two women were able to command this loyalty, suggested in local Vietnamese culture at the time women of noble rank could hold authority in military command. This is also corroborated by other cases in Southeast Asian history where women had high status, by the way. So, 40 CE, the revolt breaks out. According to historical records, the Trung sisters managed to rally a large force. Traditional accounts say they assembled an army of some 80,000 followers, and notably, many of their generals were women. Vietnamese legend lovingly named several, like Phung Thi Chinh, and who was, by the way, a woman said to have given birth on the battlefield and kept fighting anyway, which, well, that's an achievement of its own. They capitalized on the element of surprise. The Han garrisons and officials in the region were caught off guard by what seemed to them to be an unlikely quarter, and by the swift mobilization of the Lac Viet. The rebellion spread quickly. The Trung sisters' forces targeted centers of Han power. They attacked the Chinese strongholds and administrative cities of Jiaozhi and neighboring commanderies. And in quick succession, they overran dozens of towns and settlements that had been under Han control. The hated governor, Su Ding, had to flee for his life. Within moments, the Trung sisters had effectively liberated a vast region. Later traditions say they seized as many as 65 cities and strongholds. Flush with success, Trung Trak was proclaimed queen, sometimes given the title Queen Regnant of Lin Nam. So for about 2 years, they ruled an independent territory free from Han domination. And that was an extraordinary achievement, given that the Han Empire at the time was near its height under Emperor Guangwu. And one can view it as both a large-scale act of revenge and an early war of independence. Trung Trak's motivations, as recorded, were clearly to punish the Chinese for killing her husband and to restore dignity and the autonomy of her people. That dual objective certainly resonated widely. Many who joined them likely had their own scores to settle. Chinese rule had displaced local leaders and imposed foreign cultural norms, including changes that eroded the traditional role of women in inheritance and society. Some scholars suggest one factor in the rebellion was the Chinese imposition of patriarchal order over a previously more matriarchal or at least egalitarian local culture. However, the Han Empire was not just going to let this slide. The rebellion would not go unanswered. By 41 CE, once news reached the Han court, and the initial shock had subsided, Emperor Guangwu ordered a retaliatory expedition. He dispatched one of his best generals, Ma Yuan, known as the wave-quelling general, to lead the counterattack. And so, in 42 CE, Ma Yuan marched south with a veteran army. Sources indicate he had about 20,000 regular troops plus auxiliaries, and advanced methodically into the Red River Delta. The Han were determined to crush this revolt and reassert control, partly as a warning to other restive regions. The Trung sisters faced the challenge of defending against a disciplined, well-equipped imperial force. According to Chinese accounts, the sisters fought bravely. Several battles occurred over the year 42 and into 43, as Ma Yuan pushed into rebel-held territory. Eventually, a decisive confrontation took place, traditionally said to be at Lang Bach, perhaps in the vicinity of modern-day Hanoi. the Han army, with superior organization, gradually gained the upper hand. One by one, the rebel-held towns fell. Thousands of the Trung Sisters supporters were killed, the ones who weren't surrendered. Finally, the Trung Sisters themselves were defeated. Han records claim that by early 43, both Trung Trak and Trung Nge were captured and executed, beheaded by Ma Yuan's forces. Vietnamese legend, however, holds that facing the undefeatable threat, the sisters threw themselves into a river to avoid the dishonor of capture. In any case, their revolt was extinguished, and Han authority was brutally reinstated. Ma Yuan, to prevent further uprisings, carried out reprisals. He reportedly massacred resisting aristocratic families, executed thousands of locals, and even melted down prized bronze drums, symbols of the power for Viet tribes, to make a statue of the Han court, a symbolic disarming of the native culture. And so the rebellion of the Trung Sisters ended in blood and reoccupation, but its legacy endured in the Vietnamese memory as the first uprising against foreign rule, and of course a testament to Vietnamese valor and desire for autonomy. And the revenge aspect is critical to this story. It was the outrage of one woman that lit the spark. In historical hindsight, one might say, the rebellion was inevitable given the tensions, but without Trung Trak's personal leadership motivated by vengeance, it might not have coalesced when it did. In any case, the sisters became martyrs and inspirations for later generations, and indeed nearly 200 years later, another woman would lead a similar revolt against the Chinese rule, likely inspired by the Trung's memory. Okay, last one for today. If you're enjoying this concept, well, perhaps we'll do more revenge stories, like revenge stories of ancient Greece, revenge stories of ancient Rome. Let me know what you think, and then we'll do them. In any case, now we actually turn to India, a good place to end off for today. You see, revenge in antiquity was not only the province of warriors and queens. Sometimes it was the careful plan of a scholar-statesman that altered the course of history. In ancient India, the transition from the Nanda dynasty to the Maurya Empire, late 4th century BCE, is wrapped in legends of intrigue and vengeance. At the center of this story is Chanakya, also known as Kautilya or Vishnugupta, a Brahmin scholar often credited as the author of the Arthashastra, a treatise on statecraft. Chanakya's protege was Chandragupta Maurya, who would become the first emperor of the Mauryan Empire. The tale of how Chandragupta came to power, toppling the ruling Nanda king, is told in various ancient Indian sources, Buddhist, Jain, and Hindu texts like the Buddhist Mahavamsa and later chronicles such as the Sanskrit play Mudrarakshasa, Some of the Hindi names are a little bit difficult, Sanskrit names and so on. Well, while the details vary, a consistent thread is revenge. That revenge that Chanakya vowed against the tyrannical Nanda king, and how that personal vendetta led to the founding of a new imperial dynasty. So let's see where it all starts. The Nanda Empire, based in Magadha, which is modern Bihar up in the north, was one of the most powerful kingdoms in India around the 4th century. The last Nanda king is often referred to as Dana Nanda. He was reputed to be immensely wealthy. The Nandas were said to hoard treasure, but also arrogant and unpopular among many of his subjects and courtiers. According to Buddhist tradition, Chanakya first encountered Dhammananda at a ceremony or court assembly, where Chanakya's appearance, he was supposedly physically unattractive, shabbily dressed Brahmin caused the king to ridicule and insult him. One account says Dhanananda publicly insulted Chanakya for his ugliness and ordered him to be thrown out of the gathering. Well, understandably, Chanakya felt humiliated, but not before he swore an oath that he would overturn the Nanda dynasty and cast Dhanananda down from power. Now this is a remarkable scenario, a learned man vowing to destroy a king, essentially just because of an insult. But in the context of ancient values, a patron or ruler was expected to show respect to Brahmins, that is, learned priests, and mistreating one was both sacrilegious and politically unwise. Chanakya's pride and sense of justice were inflamed. In another version of the legend from Jain texts, it wasn't exactly the king, but a subordinate who insulted Chanakya. But the result is the same. Chanakya determined that the Nanda regime must end. Of course, you couldn't just have a lone scholar overthrow a king by himself. Chanakya thus sought out a suitable instrument for his revenge, someone who could claim the throne and rally support. And as fate would have it, he found Chandragupta, a young man of either royal lineage or at least great ambition. Different sources describe Chandragupta's origins differently. Some say he was of a noble but fallen family, and others say he was of relatively humble birth, but clearly had leadership qualities. Chanakya took Chandragupta under his wing, educating him in politics and war, essentially grooming him to fulfill the destiny of toppling the Nandas. Chanakya tested Chandragupta's resolve and intelligence through various clever ordeals. One famous anecdote is that Chandragupta demonstrated ruthlessness by cutting off another candidate's head to retrieve an amulet, proving he had the necessary lack of hesitation to be a monarch. Armed with Chandragupta's charisma and claim, Chanakya set about building an alliance and army. This period coincided with the invasion of northwest India by Alexander the Great in 326 BCE, by the way, and the subsequent power vacuum after Alexander's departure in 324. Chanakya was astute in seizing this moment of disarray. He is said to have gained support from various quarters dissatisfied with Nanda rule, local chiefs, former generals, and even some of the common people who chafed under the heavy taxes. The Nandas, for all their wealth, were not beloved. Chanakya was also skilled in resource gathering. One tale claims he discovered a hidden treasure to fund the campaign, or even used a crafty alchemical trick to multiply gold, as one legend suggests turning one coin into 8 through a secret. Likely metaphors, of course, for savvy financial and strategic planning. Either way, I wish I knew how to do that. Well, the initial attempts to overthrow the Nandas were not immediately successful. One account in the Jain tradition and a play called Mudrara Shaksa suggests that Chandragupta and Chanakya's first attack on the capital Pataliputra ended in failure, with their army beaten and scattered. Forced to flee, though, they learned from their mistakes. A popular folklore anecdote illustrates Chanakya's learning process. While in hiding after a defeat, Chandragupta overheard an old woman scolding her child for burning his fingers by eating from the center of a hot porridge, saying he should have taken from the cooler edges first. Well, Chanakya supposedly drew a lesson from this. They had been like a foolish child, striking at the center, i.e. the capital Pataliputra, first. Instead, they should conquer the outlying regions and cut off resources and support the center before attacking the capital itself. Well, this kind of strategic thinking aligns well with the principles that Chanakya later espoused in the Arthashastra about weakening an enemy through its peripheries and alliances. Thus recalibrated, Chandragupta and Chanakya adopted a war of attrition and coalition building. Over a couple of years, they gradually took control of border regions and isolated Magadha. They won over or subdued smaller kingdoms and republican clans, neighboring Nanda territory, whittling down Dhanananda's sphere. Chanakya also engaged in diplomacy and subterfuge. One story describes how he managed to sow discord within the Nanda court. The Nanda chief minister was initially a loyalist. His name was Rakshasa in the play. But Chanakya created such circumstances, possibly spreading misinformation and bribing key figures, that the Nanda leadership became divided and demoralized. Finally, around 321, Chandragupta's forces besieged Patlipatra. Facing betrayals from his own ranks and the gathering strength of Chandragupta's coalition, Dhanananda was defeated. Some accounts say Dhanananda was killed in battle. Others say he was allowed to go into exile, with Chanakya perhaps having promised him his life in exchange for surrender, though folklore often prefers the dramatic version where the cruel king is slain, live by the sword, die by the sword sort of thing. In any case, the Nanda dynasty had ended, and Chandragupta Maurya ascended the throne of Magadha, establishing the Mauryan dynasty, which could soon rule over most of the Indian subcontinent. And so, Chanakya's revenge was complete. The man who had insulted him was utterly dethroned and erased from power. But Chanakya did not stop at revenge. He became the chief advisor to Emperor Chandragupta, essentially like a vizier or a prime minister. In that capacity, he was instrumental in consolidating the Mauryan Empire and implementing policies, many of which were reflected in the Arthashastra's advice. It is said that one of Chanakya's first acts after Chandragupta took power was to ensure the former Nanda ministers either joined the new regime or were neutralized. In the Sanskrit drama Mudrada Shasa, Chanakya cleverly persuades the brilliant Nanda minister Rakshasa to serve Chandragupta, thus turning a foe into a friend for the stability of a new empire. Well, of course, from a historical perspective, separating fact from fiction is a little challenging because our sources have their own agendas and embellishments. However, the core of it is plausible. Internal dissatisfaction with the Nandas, combined with external pressures, like Alexander's invasion aftermath, created an opening for a usurper, a power vacuum, and a clever Brahmin strategist played a key role in that. Classical Western sources like Plutarch and Justin also mention an Indian named Sandrakotos, Chandragupta, who encountered Alexander and later conquered northwestern India. They allude to Chandragupta having been slighted by Alexander, or having seen the Greek retreat as a chance, hints that align with Indian accounts of a young leader fueled by ambition, and perhaps anger at foreigners, analogous to revenge against invasions. The theme of revenge is integral in the Indian tellings. Chanakya's personal vendetta is the spark that ignites the larger political revolution, and it shows revenge not as a blind fury but as a calculated, very patient form of justice. Chanakya waited for the right moment, gathered allies, and used intellect over brute force. It took perhaps a decade for his will to be fulfilled, but in the end he not only toppled a king, but replaced him with a whole new order. And one could argue that this was one of the most consequential acts of revenge in history, given that the Mauryan Empire would shape South Asia's history for centuries, and the influence, of course, of Buddhism, the spread of Buddhism and political ideas, certainly came out of that development. And that's it, our tales of ancient revenge. Like I said, if you want a part 2, I can certainly do that. we will find a way of getting more revenge stories. Maybe you have a revenge tale of your own. Maybe tell me in the comments how you got revenge. Nothing going into the realm of crime, please. We don't want to have any of that on our hands. Now I'm going to thank my top-tier patrons and supporters. Kimberly, Christine, Sally, Ember, Susan, Cameron, Gary, Charlene, Lynn, Therese, Katiana, Nicholas, Ulfred, Near, Alexander, Charles, Christine, Dr. Neuronerd, Aaron, Jaden, Jim, Jeffrey, Jessica, Madeline, Melissa, Orthodox Review, Scott, Shell, Wendy, Josie, Sarah, Ryan, Thor, Cameron, Stephen, Kevin, HMSHH, Crystal, Talbury, Anthony, Lucy, Brandon, Gugu Bubonic, Nicholas, Craig, Neftis, Alexander, Gokhan, Dorsey, Venita, Claire, Courtesy, Carol, Robert, Mary, Bridget, Nefertari, Yvette, Miss Mochi, 11, Allison, Free American, Jennifer, David, Cody, Brian, Are You My Mum, Rhonda, Carrie, Katie B, and Lovely. Thank you so much. And I will see you in the next video. Thanks once again for joining me. Lots of love to you all, wherever you are in the world. And farewell for now.